Walter Hayes lived most of his life in a way that never made headlines, never appeared in breaking news, and was never surrounded by loud praise, yet it was precisely people like him who held the entire system together. Because as long as the lights in homes turned on time, as long as hospitals functioned without interruption, and as long as cities did not drown in darkness, no one ever stopped to think that somewhere behind concrete walls, in the cold hum of transformers and the smell of overheated metal, there stood a man who was not allowed to make mistakes. Walter Hayes was 66 years old, and he woke up every morning before sunrise not because he feared being late, but because his body had long been trained by decades of responsibility, anxiety, and the constant expectation of a phone call that could come at any moment, because electricity does not ask whether it is convenient or not, it simply disappears, and when it does, someone has to be ready. He was an electrician, but in truth that word did not even begin to describe what he really was, because he knew the aging power systems of his country better than most engineers knew their own homes. He remembered which substations had been built in a hurry, which lines had been repaired temporarily and never fully replaced, which diagrams no longer matched reality, and which systems worked only because no one dared to touch them without absolute necessity. When serious power instability began across the country, when overloaded networks started to fail, when officials spoke of reforms while everything on the ground depended on outdated solutions and even older people, Walter's name was mentioned more and more often, spoken with respect and sometimes even relief, because everyone knew that if Walter arrived, the chances of restoring the power were far higher. He never liked attention and never accepted being called a hero, always saying that he was simply doing his job, yet the truth was that over 40 years he had prevented total collapse dozens of times, working through nights, storms, and emergencies, making decisions under pressure where there was no room for error. Long ago, Walter had dreamed of a very different life, but after his father, who was also an electrician, died on the job, Walter understood that someone had to carry on the work, and he did so not out of pride, but out of a sense of duty that grew heavier with every passing year. That day began like any other, although something inside him felt unsettled, but Walter had learned not to trust such feelings, because if you listen to every fear, you may never take a single step, and at the substation he was called to, everything was complicated, old, and dangerous, as usual, with documentation that did not match reality, cables that had been replaced without updated diagrams, and loads that had long exceeded what the system was designed to handle. Young specialists worked nearby, watching Walter with complete trust, because to them he was a man who had answers even when no manual did, and that trust mattered more to him than any award. He checked everything twice, then a third time, paused, thought carefully, and made a decision that by all logical measures was correct, a decision based on experience, knowledge, and dozens of similar situations in the past, but this time the system responded differently. The lights went out instantly. Not in a single neighborhood, not on a few streets, but almost everywhere. The city fell into darkness, transportation stopped, communication networks began to fail, hospitals switched to backup generators, and in that moment Walter understood everything without words, without shouting, without explanation, because the numbers on the panels and the dead silence of the room spoke louder than any accusation. He knew it was his mistake. No one else's. His. At first there was silence, that dangerous kind of silence that always comes before the storm, and then came the phone calls, the shouting, the blame, the news reports, the headlines, and very quickly a name appeared, a name that had been spoken with respect just days earlier and was now spoken with anger and frustration. People needed someone to blame, and the blame was convenient, because he was old, he was well known, and he had made a mistake. On social media, people wrote that someone like him should have retired long ago, that people like him were holding the country back, that no single person should carry such responsibility, and no one mentioned 40 years of uninterrupted service, thousands of sleepless nights, or hundreds of systems saved, because none of that mattered in the moment when the lights went out. When Walter walked down the street, he felt the looks, not always hostile, but often cold, and that indifference hurt more than open anger, because it meant he was no longer seen as a human being, only as a problem that had already happened. At home, he sat in silence, staring at a lamp that burned steadily and calmly, thinking about how strange the world is, where you are valued only as long as you remain unnoticed. But the moment you make one mistake, all the years disappear as if they never existed. He did not search for excuses and did not shift the blame, because he knew that responsibility is not only when everything works, but also when everything fails, and so he returned to the site, worked alongside the team, quietly, without explanations, until the system finally came back to life. When the lights returned, people sighed with relief, but no one said thank you, and Walter did not expect it, because he understood that gratitude is temporary and memory is short. A few days later, he wrote his resignation, not because he was forced to, but because he realized he could no longer work in a system where trust disappeared faster than electricity during a blackout. On his last day, he walked through the substation, touched the cold metal, listened to the familiar hum, and silently said goodbye to the life that had defined him. A month later, another failure occurred, complex and confusing, and one of the young engineers quietly said that if Walter Hayes were here, things might have gone differently. But Walter was gone, and once again the light became a problem. And perhaps it was only then that someone finally realized that the true value of those who hold the light becomes visible only when they are gone, leaving behind a darkness that no one else can dispel with the same quiet confidence as before.